So let's talk about Ukraine. Speaking of great news. Well, this is somewhat interesting. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Ukraine's first grain shipment actually departed for the first time since the Russian invasion. There have been mines and blockades in the Black Sea, also some parts on the Ukrainians, which was causing absolute havoc in wheat markets across the globe, leading to warnings of a global famine and of food crisis. This was specifically in Africa, where a large portion of this grain ultimately was heading towards. However, people are still saying that just the 4 to 6 month disruption already in the wheat market is going to cause havoc in 2022 alone, and that this, if anything, this will help the situation in 2023. Regardless, it is good for the Ukrainian economy that this began to flow, because the Ukrainian economy has contracted by almost a third of their GDP since the Russian invasion. Grain is one of the most significant exports from Ukraine. Like I've said, is known previously as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, part of the reason why it was so strategically important to them, and was defended very heavily and fought over, actually, with the Nazis back in the 1940s. Now, farming currently, farming before the war was 40% of Ukrainian export and employed 14% of that population. We've seen previously Russian-specific targeting of grain infrastructure around Ukraine, also within the port of Odessa, as we saw the immediate, kind of shelling of that area after signing this agreement. But they did let this ultimately go through. I'm not sure what it means diplomatically. I wouldn't view it as a sign that things are moving necessarily in a better direction. If anything, it just kind of shows you we're in this frozen war of attrition. Yes, there's some movement. However, there's a counterattack, which we're about to get to, which is being planned by the Ukrainians, but it seems to be working slightly, but not all that well. Russian ground has been gained. The Donbas region is almost being completely evacuated by the Ukrainians, and it just looks like this is going to go on for years to come. And so this isn't an opening to any larger diplomatic agreement, but that doesn't mean that it's not a good thing. It could be a precursor, perhaps in the future, to saying, okay, let's hammer this thing out, and you can exist, and we'll have our territory over here. But I still think we're a very, very long way away from that.
Very far away from that. Yeah, I mean, that would be the hope. I don't know if it's a justified hope, but that would be the hope, that at least being able to hammer out this deal and have it be respected by both sides and move forward and actually have a grain shipment go out, that's the very early phases of restarting the diplomatic talks that, frankly, the West was opposed to when they were happening before, and that Boris Johnson in particular went and made sure they ultimately were blown up and didn't move forward. Not that the Russians have really created any opportunities or any olive branches here to bring the Ukrainians back to the table. In terms of the hunger crisis, which is, the worst that it has been in quite a long time. As many as 828 million people, that's 1/10 of the world population, was undernourished last year. That is, according to the Food and Agricultural Organization, that is the highest figure in decades. So the problem in terms of, these grain shipments really easing the crisis, first of all, this is just grain that goes on the world market. So it might help to start to bring prices down and make grain and foodstuffs more affordable and accessible for poor nations in particular. But there are so many other factors undergirding this crisis than just the war that analysts are saying this is really, unfortunately, a drop in the bucket. You have climate crises that have particularly struck, droughts have struck the Horn of Africa that have created a massive refugee crisis. You have, of course, political instability, which has exacerbated all of that. And then you add on top of that COVID, which crushed a lot of people's incomes and crushed the economies of everywhere around the world. But of course, poor developing nations were the hardest hit. So the reporting out of these regions, the kids who are literally starving to death for one of $100 of high nutrition course, it's absolutely horrific and heartbreaking. And it also does remind me that while our nation has been so focused on Ukraine, which I understand. The Ukrainian cause is incredibly just, and the suffering of those people is incredibly important and significant, something we should care a lot about. There are a lot of other regions of the country, of the world, that are really suffering. So as one example, as of Monday, a UN appeal for $2.2 billion in humanitarian aid for Ukraine has been 93% filled. but similarly large appeals for countries like Sudan, Afghanistan, where we are denying the Taliban regime and the Afghan people their own money, and the Democratic Republic of Congo received only 21 to 45% of requested funds. And I fully blame the media for that state of affairs, because it all depends on, where they decide to go and which heartwarming stories they decide to show, whose humanity they choose to ultimately put on display. And so, the American people and I think the global population, a lot of people have rallied to the Ukrainian cause, and that's a beautiful thing. But it's, a lot of crises that go unnoticed and a lot of humanity that goes unseen in their incredibly selective coverage of global catastrophes.
Well, it's more just, look, all policy has a reaction, and it's all about trade-offs, like we were talking about with Taiwan. Yeah, technically, anybody can go to Taiwan. If they're Speaker of the House, you're the co-equal branch of government. Now, should you? Should you maybe think about why? Same with sanctions. I mean, we have at this point, the U.S. consumers paid hundreds of billions of dollars as a result of our sanctions policy against Russia. So should that not be then weighed against what we have gotten for it? Well, this is another issue from the UN. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. They say we are, quote, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. This is from the UN chief, citing specifically the war that's happening in Ukraine. And as I was speaking about the battlefield, because again, I think this is very important. Remember, our policy there is to justify what is happening and supporting the Ukrainian military. So then we need to very critically assess, well, is it worth it relative to what we're watching? Let's put this on the screen here from the BBC. So Ukrainian military is trying to mount a counteroffensive in the region of Kherson. And Ukrainian forces signaled their intention to recapture it as this counteroffensive has begun in the south. However, the control of it, which fell to Russia earlier this year, and why it matters is because of its proximity to Crimea and the establishment of a land bridge. But no tactical gains have yet been made on the ground. The offensive itself is gaining pace in terms of military equipment. The U.S. just yesterday greenlit another $8 billion of military equipment sent over to Ukraine in order to try and bolster this counteroffensive. So we need to watch this very critically. Like, if this does not work, it is a clear and resounding message to us that despite the billions of dollars, despite all the support, not only in military equipment, but despite the economic and political support on behalf of the United States and the European Union, that, look, it is not within a feasible realm that the Ukrainian military is going to achieve any sort of battlefield offensive capability, and that means that it's time to negotiate and it's time to talk. Maybe the Ukrainians will get there, but the situation in the Ukrainian government right now is not so good.
Right.
So I think we'll talk about this tomorrow, but Tom Friedman, buried in his piece about Taiwan.
How I noticed that too.
This is very shocking, saying, and I'm just teasing it for the audience, he said specifically that relations between the U.S. and between the White House and Zelensky are actually not very good right now, specifically because Zelensky, for reasons that are completely mystifying, fired two of the most senior intel officials and law officials in the Ukrainian government. And there are perhaps allegations of corruption surrounding that action. The cool and the mistrust between Washington and Kyiv at this moment, very significant. It hasn't yet broken out into the public view, but it just, again, shows you that there is fractures in our Ukraine policy and that many of the warnings about wholeheartedly just backing this without any sort of checks or, discussion ahead of time may have been a folly and a problem.
Yeah, and that the media clampdown of any saying like, this government had some problems before we got involved.
Right.
That was like, how could you say that? Zelensky's a hero and he's perfect and that's all there is to say about it. I'll read you the section from this Friedman op-ed, which was about Taiwan, but he brings up Ukraine as a way of pointing to like, hey guys, this is really not the time to be doing this Taiwan thing. He says there is funny business going on in Kyiv. On July 17th, Zelensky fired his country's prosecutor general and the leader of his domestic intelligence agency, the most significant shakeup in his government since the Russian invasion in February, be the equivalent of Biden firing Merrick Garland and Bill Burns on the same day. But I still haven't seen any reporting that convincingly explains what that was all about. It'd be nice if the media got on top of that one. It is as if we don't want to look too closely under the hood in Kyiv for fear of what corruption or antics we might see when we have invested so much there. And he says more on the dangers of that another day. And also, as you point out, directly says that, quote, there is deep mistrust between the White House and Ukrainian President Zelensky, considerably more than has been reported. So really important. I mean, Friedman is as insidery as it gets.
The reason you should believe it is because Biden talks to him literally all the time.
Directly,
and hosts
yes.
him at the White House. So you take that for what you
Yes, exactly. I just want to go back for a moment because I think it is so important to what the Secretary General of the UN is saying about being one misunderstanding or miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. Because this is something that is really important to keep in the front of your mind, even as this conflict and this war grinds on and on and on. These are the stakes that we're talking about in this proxy war that we have chosen to be all in with against Russia. Those are the stakes. One miscalculation, one misunderstanding away from nuclear annihilation. And by the way, it is not just in our proxy war with Russia where those are the stakes. We also have decided, partly because of our policy vis-a-vis Russia, to get all the way back in bed with the Saudis. That has effectively gone to completely kill the possibility of re-entering the Iranian nuclear deal. And so that also creates another potential source of misunderstanding, miscalculation, and, risks for global peril. Now, when you layer on top of that Pelosi's dumbass trip to Taiwan, this is a really scary moment that we're living through right now that, frankly, I think people, you and I, and people of our generation growing up post-Cold War have really not had to reckon with and sit with for, we never have. Past generations have had this looming threat hanging over them in a very tangible way that we have never experienced. And now here we are right back in that place.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.